So back in March of 2010, my sister picked up Final Fantasy 13 when it released worldwide. She was the Final Fantasy fan at the time, I was not, and when I was watching her play this game, I thought it looked pretty cool. It has an action-packed opening. I thought Lightning's design was absolutely phenomenal. I very much still do, by the way. Anyway, I remember my sister quit this game when she got to Grand Pulse, where the game finally opens up after about 20 hours of gameplay. Interesting place to quit because this is where the game quote-unquote gets good. Many people quit beforehand because 20 hours is not soon enough. But yeah, when she stopped playing, I decided to make my own save and try out the game myself. I don't remember much about my experience with this game back in 2010, but I do recall it was entertaining enough for me to stick with it for a while. I did eventually stop playing as well because I was a scrub and couldn't defeat the Sky Tank boss. Ever since then, the internet has shaped my perception to thinking that Final Fantasy 13 is a horrible game. For years I thought maybe it is a bad game and I couldn't realize it as a little kid. So about 11 years later in 2021, I decided to revisit the game, completed it, and I actually liked it. Yeah, I know, let it out.
Probably should have covered that.
Alright, hear me out. I want to make it clear that my positive experience with this game is definitely influenced by the fact that I did not get it around launch as a Final Fantasy fan with high expectations. This is a game that I just pulled back out of the shelf after it was sitting there for over a decade, not expecting much, and it surprised me. Alright, even though I said I like this game overall, I will say that the first 2 opening hours are pretty rough. I actually don't mind the repetitiveness of this game where you just run forward and get into fights until you reach a cutscene. Rinse and repeat for pretty much the entire game. The problem is the combat in the opening 2 hours is not fun. So the combat in this game, your character doesn't take action with every button you press. When you press them, you first select the moveset you want to attack with, and then the enemy you want to attack, and your character will attack once the ATB meter fills up in the bottom left corner. You'll mostly be using the auto battle feature in which the game chooses your attacks for you. It's faster since you don't have to take the time to manually choose your attacks, and the auto battle generally chooses ideal attacks. Like when multiple enemies are close to each other, the AI will know to have area of effect attacks ready for you. It will also choose attacks that your enemies are weak to if you have that information in those attacks. And all of this is just through pressing a single button. I was winning battles during the first few hours of this game by literally just spamming the X button on my controller. And the game awarded me with a 5-star ranking every time. Sure, occasionally I had to go into the item menu to pop a potion whenever my health was low, but that barely adds any complexity to the combat. However, I do understand why the combat is so simplistic in the opening. The game, of course, is just giving you the very basics of combat, and it correlates with the fact that the characters are just normal humans during this point of the game. The battle system gets more complex as soon as the characters are cursed by a foul sea, becoming Lissy, so I'm gonna give the opening a pass. I dig how the gameplay kinda corresponds with the plot and circumstances. And I gotta say, when the characters have Lissy powers, and roles are involved in the combat, that's when I start really having fun with the game. So there's gonna be a total of 6 roles you can assign to the characters. There's the Commando, which is a physical attacker. It's basically what you use and only use for the first 2 hours of the game. Then there's the Ravager, who does magic attacks. You also have the Synergist, who buffs up your party, and the Saboteur, who debuffs your enemies. Finally, there are the more defensive roles. There's the Sentinel, who tank themselves, and lastly the Medic, who heals the party. And the characters have all of these abilities due to their newly granted superpowers. When you assign each character in your party a role, that makes a paradigm, which is like a formation if you will. You can make a total of 6 paradigms and switch between them whenever you want or find necessary during battle. For instance, you could be using a more offensive paradigm with Commandos and Ravagers, but could find yourself having to switch to a more defensive paradigm with Medics and Sentinels whenever enemies are about to launch a powerful attack, or when your party's health is low. The main thing you'll always want to focus on in battle is getting your enemies staggered. When enemies are staggered, they are in a vulnerable state where you can do heavy damage to them. The degree of vulnerability depends on the enemy. Like, some enemies won't be able to attack anymore if they're staggered, while others will still be able to fight back. Regardless, your attacks do more damage when enemies are staggered, which is what you should always want. In order to get enemies staggered, you need to keep attacking them until their stagger meter located on the top right corner of the screen completely fills up. The fastest way to fill up the stagger bar is having Ravagers attacking with magic attacks, but the meter also drains really quickly when that's all you're using. That's where the commando role comes in. The commando is the complete opposite. It makes very little progress on the stagger meter on its own, but it keeps the meter from dropping so fast. So it's really important to have these two roles work together, especially for the first step of staggering enemies. Here's an example. In this battle, I started off with a paradigm with at least a commando and some Ravagers. The Ravagers will start making some good progress on the stagger bar, while the commando prevents it from dropping really fast. Once the meter was stable, I switched to a paradigm in which everyone are Ravagers, filling up the stagger bar as fast as I can. When enemies are staggered, you generally then want to attack with commandos because physical attacks deal the highest damage. Also, while an enemy is staggered, their stagger meter starts draining, indicating how long they'll remain staggered. Quite often, you'll find yourself having to stagger enemies multiple times to defeat them, especially later in the game. When attacking a staggered enemy, you're also continuing to increase its chain gauge percentage, increasing your damage multiplier as you keep attacking. So yeah, that's my overview of the battle system, and I think it's really fun. The other roles become more relevant as you get into more difficult battles, requiring you to really strategize with your paradigm setup and become much more tactical. With the auto battle feature, this game is often criticized for playing itself, but I think that criticism is kind of exaggerated, along with some others I'll get into. But yeah, choosing your attacks is not exactly the highlight of this battle system. It's more about setting up a good paradigm deck and knowing when to efficiently and appropriately switch between them in accordance to the situation in battle. It's cool if you don't like the combat. I just don't agree with the claims that it barely takes any thought or effort to win battles, at least beyond the first 2 hours of the game. So every time you win a battle, you earn Christogen points, also known as CP. These points are used to upgrade the roles of the characters in the Crystarium, which is kind of like a skill tree. You can permanently increase the character's strength, magic, and HP. You can also learn new abilities related to the role you're upgrading. Like if you're upgrading the Ravager role, you can learn new magic attacks. Some abilities are exclusive to certain characters, and some are just learned sooner than others. Like the overall game itself, this upgrading system is linear. You just kinda make upgrades through the one-way path of the Crystarium, and whatever upgrades are in that path is what you'll get. Some decision making is involved once the Crystarium branches out a little, where you gotta decide which path you currently want to spend your CP on. The only issue I had with the Crystarium is that no matter what role you're upgrading, there would be strength, magic, and HP boost. Like at an early point in the game, I was upgrading Vanille's Ravager role, hoping to increase her magic stats, but there were some strength upgrades in that category as well. The issue was that increasing her strength was useless because she cannot learn the commando role yet. So I was just wasting CP, having to make upgrades that served no purpose at the time. I couldn't skip the unnecessary upgrades either due to the linear system. However, I did eventually realize that this issue was a double-edged sword. In another case, I wanted to keep increasing Lightning's strength, but I have already reached the current level cap for her commando role. Well, the thing is, I was still able to because there is strength boost in her Ravager role. So overall, I think the Crystarium is fine. It's simple, it's clean, and as long as my characters are getting stat boosts, I'm happy. Speaking of level caps, yes, there is a limit to how much you can upgrade the characters depending on where you are in the story. I defeated a giant Bulbasaur at the end of the chapter, and look at that, Crystarium expanded. I really didn't mind this either. Throughout this most recent playthrough of mine, I battled almost every enemy that I saw in front of me, and I don't think I ever reached the level cap for all the available roles. Even if I have, I'm sure the Crystarium expanded very soon after, because I don't recall a single time that I couldn't make any more upgrades due to the level cap. Probably one of the biggest complaints about the combat is that when the party leader, the character you're playing as, goes down, it's game over. I'm not gonna defend this one, okay? I think this is objectively bad game design. I mean, look at this. I was just about to defeat this giant robot and out of nowhere it one-shots me at like full health and it's game over. Game over? Lightning is fine on the side over there. Why doesn't the game just switch me to her so I can use a Phoenix down or something? Having said that, I can't say that this mechanic was a big negative for me personally. It didn't happen often enough for me to get annoyed with it, and whenever it did happen, it wasn't a big deal. Like, I beat that giant robot on my second try, and the battle took about 3 minutes. I was okay with losing 3 minutes of my life. I can imagine the pain of being in a battle for like 10 minutes and just lose because you went down, but the other party members are still standing. It could happen, but it never did for me. So what I'm pretty much saying is, if you're somewhat of a gamer like myself, this mechanic shouldn't be that much of a problem for you. At the start of this video, I mentioned that it takes about 20 hours for this game to open up. The thing is, I didn't feel like I had to play this game for that long to start having fun. As I talked about the opening earlier, I started enjoying this game after about 2 hours. Let's talk about the linearity real quick. I didn't think it was that bad.
Watch it!
Look, I never felt like I was just constantly running down a lifeless hallway. When looking at the big picture, yes, you're just running forward in this game, but there are jumps and turns to make, platforms to ride on. Like in Palom Polum, one moment you're on the rooftops, then you'll jump down into a tunnel, run down the tunnel and turn right into the city, make some more jumps and turns traversing the city. Like, I'm not saying it's amazing level design, but like I said, I wasn't expecting very much from this game, and I felt like there was at least some effort put into designing the environments. If the game was just running down this bright white hallway for 20 hours, that would have been a different discussion for me, and that's what everyone makes it sound like when they talk about the linearity. As for the combat, you don't get to experiment with the battle system to its full potential for these first 20 hours or so, because you'll mostly be working with duo parties instead of a full trio, but that's just how the characters are split up for the story, and each character only has a maximum of 3 out of the 6 roles. Like Lightning initially only has Commando, Ravager, and Medic. Snow only has Commando, Ravager, and Sentinel, and so on. You also don't get to choose your own party. The game decides who you play as and who is in your party. One moment you'll have Saz, Vanille, and Hope as a party. Once Lightning joins up with them, you'll just automatically have her replacing Hope, and you can't switch back to him even when he's technically still there. But in most cases, the party you're working with and who you're controlling makes sense. Between Saz, Vanille, and Hope, Saz would definitely be the leader, which is why you'll play as him for a bit. In a particular part of the game when Lightning and Hope are together, Hope tells her that he wants to take the lead, so that's why you'll be controlling him for a section of the game. Despite all these limitations and assigned parties, I still found the game to be enjoyable because you still need to strategize with what you're just given. In battle, remember when I said it's usually ideal to start with a Ravager to get the stagger bar going and a Commando to keep it stable? Well, there's a part in the game where it has you working with Saz and Vanille, and neither of them has Commando at this time. Saz only has Ravager and Synergist, while Vanille has Ravager, Saboteur, and Medic. At first, I was having a hard time getting enemies staggered with these roles, but then I realized something. A Saboteur can act as a Commando in the sense that it keeps the stagger meter stable. So I was ultimately still able to stagger enemies by starting battles with at least Vanille as a Saboteur and then switching to double Ravager. In addition, the enemies would be debuffed because that's what the Saboteur primarily does. I just found it so satisfying improvising competent paradigms out of the limited roles available to me. Now, how would I set up my paradigms with a party of Lightning and Hope? How about Snow and Hope? Fang and Lightning? The first 20 hours are also where I think the most interesting story elements and character development takes place. I like the bond between Lightning and Hope. It was nice to see Lightning develop a soft spot for someone since she's such an angry character, which eventually leads her to become a more compassionate person. The tension between Hope and Snow and Saz and Vanille and their confrontations are all great stuff as well. And seeing Hope and Snow becoming pals after hours of Hope talking about killing him and actually tried to, absolutely warmed my heart. So around 17 hours into the game, the characters finally all unite, and you get to finally choose who's in your party and who's the party leader. This game just gradually gets better over time on top of me already enjoying it. At this point, it's no longer setting up paradigms to your best ability with an assigned party. It's now experimenting with which 3 of the 6 characters would make a great paradigm deck with the roles they currently have. For me, it was Lightning, Hope, and Saz. Lightning because she is best waifu, fight me. Saz is great because he is and will be the only one who has learned the haste ability at this point in the game for a long time. Haste increases the party's ATB recharge time, increasing your damage per second, and it's undeniably the best buff in the game. Hope has the synergist role along with Saz, so I can make a paradigm that has 2 people buffing up the party at the same time. I also got 2 medics to heal up the party relatively fast. All 3 of these characters also know Ravager, which would help me stagger enemies as quickly as possible. Lastly, at least 2 of them know Commando, which gives the party the ability to inflict some pretty good damage on staggered enemies. This is the party I primarily used for almost the rest of the game. I didn't make any changes until I started getting the characters to learn new roles beyond their main 3. I was able to do this around 18 hours in. The reason why it took me until around the end of the game to start doing this, which is like somewhere between 40 to 50 hours, is because for some reason, it costs way too much CP to upgrade new roles for each character, and it would be better to simply continue upgrading the roles they already know. This actually did bug me a bit, since for some battles, I had to switch out Saz for someone who has Sentinel, which I needed, instead of just having him learn the role, and then I would just switch back to him after I was done with whoever I temporarily needed. It's really a bizarre limitation because the game basically intends for you to have full versatility with the battle system after you complete the main story, but let's be real. Those who actually make it to the end of this game are most likely the ones willing to spend several more hours completing the post-game content, which I'll talk a little more about later. As estimated, I made it to the legendary world of Grand Pulse about 20 hours in. The game finally opens up. Whoa, it's a giant field to explore with giant monsters roaming around. There are side quests to do. Well, I didn't stay here for very long because I kinda prefer the hallways.
Watch it!
No, I'm just kidding. I just got annihilated the very first battle I engaged in here, so I figured I'll have to come back here once I'm stronger. I just did like the first side mission, defeated a couple weaker enemies guarding some chests, and went straight to the next hallway where the game told me to go. So the enemies here were a lot tougher than the ones I've been fighting, and I'm talking about the ones before I got to Grand Pulse. I noticed I started dying a lot more often to normal encounters, and that's when I realized there is a difficulty spike. This made the game even more interesting for me. I was still holding my own against these enemies. They weren't one-hit killing me like the bigger monsters I tried fighting around here. They were just pushing me to the point where I had to start sitting up straight, take my jacket off, you know, all that stuff. And winning battles became much more satisfying. Okay, now I want to talk about the Eidolons. They're the summons in this Final Fantasy game that the characters have as part of their Lissi powers. Each character is assigned one specific Eidolon, and it gets triggered when the character becomes emotionally conflicted at a certain part in the story. You'll then need to show you're worthy to it in battle before claiming it yourself. The reason why I'm mentioning the Eidolons this late into the video is because I really didn't start using them or found them necessary until this difficulty spike. It's commonly said that the Eidolons are not very good, and I agree with that in terms of the damage they do to enemies, but they're far from being useless. Summoning your Eidolon is really a great emergency card to pull when you're in a tight situation in battle. I saw it as like my insurance. The Eidolon gives you a sense of invincibility since it heals you whenever your health is low, and if your health actually depletes, it revives you at the cost of leaving the party early. Enemies tend to attack your Eidolon anyway, keeping the pressure off you regardless. When your Eidolon goes away, your entire party returns with full health, which is very useful, especially if you were the only one standing before summoning. So I think the Eidolons are very reliable in battle by keeping you alive, but you shouldn't expect them to defeat enemies for you, because they really don't do that much damage. So when the characters return to Cocoon from Grand Pulse, it's nearing the end of the game. I'm not completely certain on this, but I want to say there's another spike in difficulty at this point, and this one was much more extreme than the last because I just started dying left and right. Like every battle I started engaging in, I was badly defeated at least once. I'm aware that I haven't been grinding very much, but I did eventually get into the rhythm of the first difficulty spike, and I was doing just fine. I didn't feel like grinding was necessary at all. Then out of nowhere, I felt completely underleveled. This was really the only time I got frustrated with this game. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind a good challenge, but the game suddenly got a bit too unbalanced for me here, which wasn't the case when I first got to Grand Pulse. Anyway, once you reach Orphan's Cradle, the final level leading up to the final boss, the game allows you to warp back to Grand Pulse, and that's exactly what I did and needed to do to start grinding. And since I was much stronger than I was when I first arrived here, it was pretty satisfying being able to defeat the stronger enemies now when they easily kicked my ass before. I kept grinding until I hit the current level cap before returning to Orphan's Cradle, and I'm glad I did because even though I maxed out my characters, this level still wasn't exactly a walk in the park. I must have spent at least 10 hours grinding back in Grand Pulse, and I'm sure it would have been a disaster if I didn't. By the way, this is where I made changes to my party because I was finally able to get all characters to learn all 6 roles through all that grinding. I just swapped out Saz for Fang because Hope has finally learned Haste as well, and Fang is simply a lot stronger than Saz. Sorry Saz. So with this new team, I got through the final level, reached the final boss, and it was surprisingly not very hard. In fact, it was really easy. I am talking about all 3 phases, and after I prevailed over this final boss, I finally finished Final Fantasy XIII for the first time. Alright, I did say I was gonna talk about the post-game earlier, so I'm gonna do that before I wrap up this video. So after completing the main story, Grand Pulse is essentially the hub world where you can do all the side missions. For these missions, you talk to these sea stones and they'll mark enemies on the map for you to go slay them. Yep, the side missions are all monster slaying, meaning more battles. You know, at least the game's consistent. And if you finish this game at your own will, I'm assuming you enjoy the combat because that's all the game is. So what's the harm in more battles, right? If that's actually the case, I think they're worth doing. You will simultaneously explore every area of Grand Pulse, tracking down the marked enemies, and some enemies from these missions really make you come up with a battle strategy that you're less used to in order to defeat them. Even relying on the auto battle feature wasn't cutting it anymore. I had to start selecting my own attacks for a particular strategy, and that made the combat even more fun and engaging. Once you complete the 14th mission, there are 64 in total by the way, chocobos will be available to traverse the giant field, and I thought this was awesome. Chocobo riding is more than I thought this game would ever offer, and I am content. So yeah, I have covered about everything I wanted to for FF13. Just wanted to share my experience with this game and highlight its undervalued strengths that I find it to have, mainly in its gameplay. In regards to the story, I'm just gonna quickly say that it has potential. I do think the story is quite interesting. The problem is that you probably wouldn't know what's going on unless you open up and read the data log in the pause menu that updates regularly throughout the game. The data log contains information on the world, the characters, their emotions and motivations. It even has detailed explanations of events in the story so far. There were times I was reading the data log and I was like, oh, okay, that's what's happening. I just can't exactly say it's good storytelling in a video game when almost all the exposition is provided through text instead of what the audience would just see and hear on screen. Even then, some things still don't make sense. The story was serviceable enough for the sake of having a story in the game, but overall, I can say with complete confidence that I thoroughly enjoyed my most recent playthrough of Final Fantasy XIII. Now that the game is quite old, and with the right expectations, I think it could be a great time. I knew going into this game again that it was just going to be battles after battles, and I ended up really having fun with the battles. Alright, I'm gonna wrap it up here. If y'all made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments what do you think of FF13. If you hate it, that's fine. A lot of what I've said here are just my opinions, and I'm open to hear whatever yours is. Alright, I'm out. Again, thanks for watching. Take it easy.